Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Can you see me okay if I'm down here? Is that fine? Okay. If not, let me know. This seems like it's too confined. If it's okay with you, before I start, I'd like to just kind of tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm so excited to talk to you about childhood obesity today, okay? Like Raina said, my name's Steve Hewlett, and I've been a clinical pharmacist or a doctor of pharmacy here at Cox for the last 27 years. And I started back in 1992, just after completing my pediatric residency in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, my first 12 years here, I was actually up on the pediatric floor and down the neonatal intensive care unit. And then after the 12 years, I had kind of an awakening in my life, and I quit and I went to the night shift. And soon thereafter, I ended up becoming the pharmacy supervisor of the second and third shift, which is what I'm still doing today. So you might be asking yourself, why is a doctor of pharmacy talking to us about childhood obesity? And I gotta tell you, I asked myself that exact same thing 2 years ago when they asked me to talk about childhood obesity at that seminar. And I think the reason they asked me is because of something that happened to me after I'd been here about 8 years. At that time, my wife and I, we were in our mid-30s, and we felt like we were, fairly healthy, and we ate fairly good, and we worked out a fair amount. And then there was this one day, let me ask you, has anybody in here ever had a child say something to them that was so blatantly honest that it absolutely floored you? Okay? Well, that's what happened to me on this one infamous day, and I remember it vividly. I was standing in my closet, and I was looking for a shirt to wear. My little 6-year-old son came up and patted me on the belly and said, "Man, Daddy, you're fat." This absolutely floored me. I mean, I never wanted to be one of those kinds of fathers that couldn't do any kind of activity that their son wanted to do just because I didn't take care of my weight and I didn't take care of my health. So immediately, my wife and I, we started on a brand new workout and nutrition routine. And without saying a word to anybody, after about 8 to 10 weeks, all of a sudden people around us started coming up and asking us what we were doing. So we taught them what we were doing, and very soon after that, we had many family, friends, and coworkers that all started doing the same thing that we were doing, and they were getting very similar results. In fact, some of those friends and coworkers are in this room right now. And as great as it was to lose that weight and to actually feel like we were getting younger and healthier, what was really life-changing about that was 2 different realizations I came to. The first realization I came to was that this is the first time that I really truly realized that we have total control over our weight and our health just by the choices we make on a day-to-day basis. And the other realization I came to is that you have no idea how many people around you that you influence without even knowing it and without saying a word, just by accomplishing something that they'd like to accomplish because of these day-to-day choices. So it was because of this, the feeling, this great feeling that we got out of actually teaching people how to get healthy, that made me actually stop working on pediatrics and switch into the night shift. So my wife and I could actually help go around and educate people on how they could start taking care of their health on the prevention side of health, instead of waiting all the way over on the other side of disease, where they can only take care of their health with medication on top of medication at higher and higher doses. So that's what leads us to 2 years ago. 2 years ago, the Pediatric Seminar Committee came and asked me if I'd talk about childhood obesity. And I said, sure, I'll do that. So I went and I put together this whole slide presentation, and had it talk together as the old, a calorie is a calorie. If you want to lose weight, you need to burn off more energy than you take in. And fat is bad and carbs are good, and, a little bit about the food pyramid. And I thought, well, just for the heck of it, I'm going to go back to the literature and just see, is there anything new out here? And oh my gosh, did I find out there is a ton of new information out there on nutrition. So I had to go back, because all this information I found out said that everything that I knew about nutrition was totally wrong. So I had to go back. What happened here? So I had to go back and I totally redid all my slides, redid my entire presentation, and came up with a new presentation. And then the Pediatric Seminar Committee came to me and said, okay, sorry, Steve, we don't need you to talk at this seminar anymore because we've changed the theme of the seminar. But by this time, I was hooked. I loved everything I was reading. And so for the last 2 years, I have read, watched, and listened to everything I can that has anything to do with nutrition, with childhood obesity, with adult obesity, with type 2 diabetes, and with metabolic syndrome. Because all 5 of these things are saying the exact same thing. Whether we're talking about adult obesity or childhood obesity, it's all the same thing. And that leads me to today. Today I'm really excited to actually start talking to you guys about everything that I've learned over these last 2 years. Now remember, this is 2 years worth of information that I'm squeezing down to a little 45-minute presentation. So I'm going to be leaving out a ton of good stuff, and I'm just going to skim the surface, but hopefully by the end of this, you're going to realize what a horrible obesity crisis we're in today and how it's just getting worse. What this obesity crisis is doing to our health and the health of our nation, what the root cause of this obesity crisis is, and most importantly, what you personally can do to help stop this obesity crisis and hopefully reverse it. So, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and get started. First, what I'm going to be talking about basically is I'm going to talk about how an excessive amount of extremely poor quality food intake, that leads to high insulin levels, and this leads to high triglyceride levels, which leads to high glucose levels, and this leads to metabolic syndrome, okay? So this is a process. Remember, this whole thing's a process. And 2 things I want you to know about this process is first, from the beginning to the end, takes about 20 to 30 years, okay? 20 to 30 years. And the other thing that's important to know about this is, well, how many people in here were born before 1980? Okay, how many people were born after 1980? Kind of pretty close to the same. This whole thing here, this actually started, we never saw any of this before 1980. Hardly any of this. And for that reason, if you think about those people who were born before 1980, think back about your yearbooks. How many kids in your classes were really obese? There wasn't that many. I bet it's probably about 5%, which is not the case now. And that's why, as far as metabolic syndrome back then, most of the patients that we saw that had metabolic syndrome, they were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. But now we're seeing patients that are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s with metabolic syndrome. And there's even some kids down here in their 20s that are showing signs of metabolic syndrome. Okay? And this is only getting worse. And so this made me think when I heard this, it's like, well, so when did this start? So then I went to the literature and I found out, according to the CDC, back in 1958, there were only about 500,000 people in the United States that had diabetes. And at that time, the majority of these were type 1 diabetes, which means the pancreas just isn't producing any insulin. Now, fast forward to 2015, and that number's gone from 500,000 people to over 30 million people who have diabetes, okay? And this is only in the patients who are 18 years and older. There's a lot of patients who are less than 18 that we'll see later that also have diabetes. And the other thing that the CDC said is now 90 to 95% of these patients that have diabetes is type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes means that it's all because of the choices that we make, okay? 2 totally different things. Type 1 diabetes means that their pancreas doesn't produce any insulin. Type 2 diabetes, the exact opposite. We're producing so much insulin that it starts causing damage. And that's what we're going to talk about during this talk. So what happened back in 1958 to make the start? Actually, something that happened back in 1955. In 1955, President Eisenhower had a heart attack, okay? Back then, heart attacks weren't that common, nothing like they are right now. So it set everybody out to find out what causes heart attacks. So this set up a series of extremely unfortunate events that I really wanted to talk about, but because of time constraints, I can't. But basically, it came down to, in 1977, Senator McGovern was tasked with coming up with the new dietary guidelines for the United States. And at this time, the person that Senator McGovern put in charge of this was a guy who did no studies on his own whatsoever. All he did was went back to an extremely flawed study back in 1958 by Ansel Keys. And Ansel Keys had this study called the 7-country study, which incidentally was a 22-country study, but only 7 countries actually fit his model, okay? So in this extremely flawed studies, and there's a ton of information about all the flaws in this is where it came up saying that dietary fat and dietary cholesterol is what causes cardiovascular disease. That is wrong. It is not. And there's a ton of stuff out now that proves that. The other thing that happened is there was a man over in Japan who came up with high fructose corn syrup, okay? And this is really important because before this time, all of our sugar came from either cane sugar or beet sugar, and both of these are pretty expensive. Now we can make sugar out of corn, and this made it very cheap and affordable. And these two things are very, very important because what happened is now the government said, talked to all our food manufacturers, said, now you guys are going to have to do 5 things. You're going to have to make food where you have massive amounts of food because we have to feed our growing population. The other thing is it has to be very cheap and affordable so everybody can buy this food. You also need to be able to keep it on the shelves for longer periods of time, so you have grocery stores where people can go get it. It also needs to be frozen so it can be transported across the country, and you need to eliminate or at least decrease the amount of fat that's in this processed food. And that's exactly what all these manufacturers did. And this is when our processed foods skyrocketed after that. Because what they did was just like they were told to do. They went and they took out all the good, healthy animal fat and they replaced it with all these extremely toxic trans fats and vegetable oils and seed oils, which are horrible for our bodies. But it allowed it to stay on the shelves for a longer period of time. The other thing it did is they took out all the good, healthy fiber and this allowed it to be frozen so it could be transported. But once they took out all the fat and they took out all the fiber, now they had to go and they had to make it more palatable. So that's where they put in the sugar as high fructose corn syrup because it's also cheap. And so what happened after this, after they did all this, which we've already seen what this did because this all happened at the same time. We've already seen what this did to the diabetes rates in our adults. So what did it do to our pediatric population? As far as childhood obesity, there was an NHANES study that was done back in 1977 to 1980. And in this NHANES study, what it showed was that from the beginning of time all the way up to 1980, our total pediatric obesity rates were only about 5%. And in the next 35 years, these obesity rates went from doubled to tripled to in our adolescence, they went up to quadrupled. From 5% up to over 20% of our adolescents are considered clinically obese, okay? Just in that 35-year period. So what did this history tell me? What this history tells me is that a low-fat diet is actually an extremely high-fat diet because of all the processed foods. Okay? Now don't get me wrong, when I talk about childhood obesity, I am not talking about how a child looks, okay? And granted, this has a ton of emotional consequences all within itself. And I'm sure Raina could get up here and give you a great talk for a whole hour just on the emotional consequences of this. But I'm not focusing on the emotional consequences, I'm gonna be focusing on the medical consequences. And again, remember, this is a process, okay? So this is a process to where a high percentage of those patients who are obese, they end up with type 2 diabetes. Okay, and a high percentage of patients with type 2 diabetes, they end up with metabolic syndrome. Okay, remember, as I go through this talk, this whole thing is a process. Type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset diabetes because we never ever used to see this in kids before. That's changed. Back when I was in 1992, when I first started here, we hardly ever saw kids with type 2 diabetes. And now we're seeing kids with it all the time. In fact, back in 2015, they had diagnosed the youngest child to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And this poor little 3-year-old girl, she weighed 77 pounds at 3 years of age. Now, in her particular case, they stopped her diabetes. She doesn't have it anymore. Because what they did was they went in and they intervened with her nutrition. They stopped all processed food and they stopped all her sugar-sweetened beverages. If they had not gone and intervened with her nutrition, the obvious next step, if you remember the process, chances are she would have been the next youngest child to be ever diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. Okay, so this leads me to think, what is metabolic syndrome? Metabolic syndrome is a combination of 5 different things, okay? It's high blood pressure, it's high blood glucose, it's high triglyceride levels, it's low HDLs, which is what they call your good cholesterol, and it's increased abdominal obesity. Okay, it's these 5 things together called metabolic syndrome. Now the first 4 are kind of self-explanatory. The 5th one is increased abdominal obesity. What does this matter? If you have increased abdominal obesity, what that is indicative that you are starting to store fat all around your visceral organs. And you were never, ever supposed to store fat around your visceral organs. This causes all kinds of organ damage and organ failure. So how do you know if you have abdominal obesity? The way you know is just measure your belly around the widest part of your belly. This measurement should be half or less than your height. So let's say you're 5'8". So that means you're 68 inches tall. Half of 68 is 34. So if you're 5'8", that means your belly, around the widest part of your belly, should be 34 inches or less. If it's more than that, that's indicative that you may be starting to store fat around your visceral organs, okay? This is not good. So who cares if you have metabolic syndrome? What does this mean? What this means is if you have these 5 things that are called metabolic syndrome, they found that this leads to organ damage to every single organ system in your body. There's not an organ system that isn't affected by this. You get this when you get your fatty liver disease, you get pancreatitis, you get cardiovascular disease, you get atherosclerosis, strokes, everything. So this made me wonder, well, if this is all the case, is type 2 diabetes, is it really progressive? Is it really irreversible? Well, it kind of all depends on how you look at it. Because if you think that you're going to cure diabetes with medications, you're wrong. There's no way. There's no medication now, and there will never be a medication that's going to cure diabetes until it can take care of the root cause. And if we don't take care of that root cause, all we're really doing with medication is treating like a Band-Aid on top of a gaping wound. All we can do is give more and more medication at higher and higher doses just to try to get the organ failure from progressing too quickly, okay? So the first way to treat the root cause is you have to know what the root cause is. And I have a feeling, before you guys ever came in here, and it was already alluded to in Michelle's talk, what the root cause is. But I'm not going to make a guess. That's no big thing. I want to be very, very clear on what the root cause is. And it is sugar, and it is processed flour, okay? The reason why it's processed flour is anytime that you take a whole grain and you pulverize that down to a powder, with a machine, what you do is you get rid of all the extremely healthy phytonutrients, you get rid of all the healthy fiber, and all you're left with is powdered glucose, okay? And powdered glucose is half of what's in sugar. So since sugar is the root cause, I'm going to make sure that you know exactly what sugar is and exactly what sugar is doing to your body, okay? This is so, so important because I don't think people realize this. First, sugar is a disaccharide, okay? It's a disaccharide because it's made up of 2 monosaccharides. It's made up of a 6-membered ring, glucose, and a 5-membered ring, fructose. Now, as far as what this is, when these are together, 50-50, that's sucrose. That's the normal table sugar that you think of. As far as high fructose corn syrup, it's the exact same thing. You just have different percentages of the fructose. So it's anywhere from 40 to 60% depending on who the manufacturer is, okay? But basically, as I talk about sugar throughout this talk, whether I say sugar, whether I say high fructose corn syrup, it's the exact same thing. So now let's break this down even more. Okay, first we'll take this part. This is the glucose. This is the 6-membered ring glucose. Glucose has been around forever. Glucose, every single cell in our body knows how to metabolize glucose for energy, okay? So when we take in a glucose load, the first thing that it does is our body uses it for energy that we need right now for our basal metabolism and then whatever activity we have going on at the time, okay? After that, anything that's left, that goes around and it gets clumped together and it gets stored. Okay, when it gets stored in plants, this is called starch. When it gets stored in the body, in animals, it's called glycogen. And in the human body, there's 2 different organs that store glycogen. That's the liver and it's the skeletal muscles. As far as the skeletal muscles, every single skeletal muscle in your body has its own little glycogen store that's only used for that one muscle. So every single skeletal muscle has the equivalent of about 1% of glycogen. Now in your liver stores about 10% of glycogen, okay? And this is the glycogen, this is the energy that we use for our fight or flight energy. We need energy now, and so our glycogen breaks into glucose, and that gives us the energy we need, okay? Now, any excess glucose that we take in, that goes straight to our liver, and that gets converted into fat, okay? That gets converted into triglycerides. And this is all perfectly normal. Because then it goes to our liver, and what it does, then our body sends it around to all our subcutaneous fat cells all around our body, and that's where it should be, in our subcutaneous fat cells. And this is the energy that we use for our fasting energy, okay? Now, I'm going to be talking about fasting every now and then through the talk, But when I talk about fasting, all I'm talking about is the time that you're not physically eating, okay? So you're gonna eat, you're gonna fast, eat. And so some people, they fast down here for like 2 to 3 hours before their next meal, and some people, they fast for 2 to 3 days, okay? So fasting just means the time that you're not eating, and that's when we should be using the energy out of our fat cells. But as you'll see, that's not what we do anymore, okay? Now the other side of this is the fructose. And I'm here to tell you, fructose is poison. Fructose is extremely toxic to our bodies. What it does, the reason it's a poison is because, remember I said that every single cell in your body can metabolize glucose. Only one organ can metabolize fructose, and that's the liver. And when it metabolizes fructose, it turns it into extremely toxic metabolites. So, how does fructose get metabolized? Like this. And no, I'm not going to go into the biochemistry of the metabolism of fructose. I just want you to see that it's been thoroughly studied. They know exactly how fructose is metabolized. So what I did was I just kind of come up with a summary slide, and I really wanted to go through each of these because it's very important, but because of time constraints, I can't do it. Just realize that all of these metabolites have a direct link straight to metabolic syndrome. They're directly related to it. But I'm just going to focus on the triglycerides since this is an obesity talk, okay? So this is something that they've just recently discovered, recently, is methylglyoxal. Methylglyoxal is a substance that's in the liver, and this substance they found is exactly what drives changing fructose straight into triglycerides. So anytime you eat processed foods, all of a sudden when you eat it, a high percentage of that gets converted straight into fat, okay, straight into triglycerides. And this, you'll see how important that is here pretty soon. So what is a triglyceride? A triglyceride is 3 fatty acids with a glycerol backbone, okay? And that's why it's called a triglyceride. And this is perfectly normal. This is healthy. This is good. There's 2 main fats in our bodies that we have. It's these fatty acids and it's cholesterol. And these are extremely good. They're important to our bodies. We use this every single cell in your body. The cell membrane is made up of these fats. A lot of the hormones that our body has is made up of these fats. And like we just said, these fatty acids are what gets stored in our subcutaneous tissue, and that's what's supposed to be used for our fasting energy, okay? So, how do we do this? So our liver has this fat and it has this cholesterol, but it has to get around all our subcutaneous tissue. So how does it do that? What the liver does is it takes this cholesterol and it takes these triglycerides and it puts them together like a cargo of a ship. And then it wraps around it, this protein. So cholesterol and fat together are called lipids. So you have these lipids in the cargo and then you have the protein ship, so that's a lipoprotein. And when you have a whole bunch of these triglycerides with this, it's called a very low density lipoprotein. If you have a few triglycerides, it's called a low density lipoprotein, okay? And that's the VLDLs and the LDLs when you go to get your cholesterol checked at the doctor's office, okay? So now they call this cholesterol, and it's not really cholesterol. Cholesterol is just part of the cargo. The whole thing is your LDLs. Now the other thing that they've taught us is that the LDLs are your bad cholesterol. That also is not true, okay? These are not bad cholesterol. This is perfectly fine. And this is exactly what the body does. The body does this because it has to get the fat out of your liver and deposit it around the body where it needs to be. However, there is a very bad LDL, and that's this little red one over here, if you can see that. This is called a small, dense LDL. And these small, dense LDLs, you eat those, and all of a sudden they go around your body and they start wreaking havoc all over your blood vessels and causing all kinds of organ damage. Okay? So there's these good VLDLs and LDLs. These are your large, buoyant LDLs, and then you have these small, dense LDLs. So what they found, so again, we have good good LDLs and bad LDLs. Okay, they're not all bad LDLs like we've been told. However, with these small, dense LDLs, what they found, what increases these, is anytime you have a diet that's high in refined sugars or high in trans fats, you have increased small, dense LDLs. So what is refined sugars and trans fats? Processed food. Okay? So these, just by eating this processed food, you're actually producing more of the truly bad LDLs. And then they go on to say uncontrolled diabetes and metabolic syndrome, but it's like, duh, it's a process. So the ones that we worried about is what's causing these in the first place. So in order to see what these small, dense LDLs do, we're going to have to go inside the blood vessels. Okay, so now we're inside the blood vessels, and this is another thing that they've just recently discovered. It's called the Glycocalyx. And the Glycocalyx is like a velvet lining that lines all the inside of all your blood vessels. Okay, and all our blood vessels have this. And it was only recently discovered because it can only be seen with an electron microscope, and it also withers when you take it out of the body. So they found out that this is extremely important because this glycocalyx, this velvet lining inside your blood vessels, it has all these hairs in it. And what this does, this tells the body what to keep in the lumen of the blood vessel and what can get down into the endothelial cell layer. Now, they've also found now that this is what happens to your glycocalyx 6 hours after a high-carb meal. It goes from these nice little hairs that's protecting you, and it shrinks down to practically nothing. When it shrinks down to nothing like this is when you start having a lot of trouble. Because now you have those large buoyant LDLs and they can just float on by. They don't cause any problems. But these small, dense LDLs, they come floating around and they get glycated with a molecule of glucose. And when you put these two together, the glucose and the small, dense LDL, those get down inside this endothelial cell layer and they just get down, and all of a sudden all these macrophages come in and they realize it's not there, and it starts tearing up your blood vessels. Very, very bad. And also realize this is after 6 hours. What do most people do within 6 hours? They eat again. Okay? So we're constantly damaging when we eat all the time and when we eat this kind of processed food. So what happens to our blood vessels? Well, the first thing that happens is you start damaging the small blood vessels. And that's when you get that normal triad that you see with diabetes, which is retinopathy, nephropathy, and neuropathies. But as you continue to eat this kind of food, continue to start producing these small, dense LDLs and continue to keep your blood glucose levels high, now you start tearing up the major vessels also. And once you turn up these major blood vessels, this is when you start getting all the organ damage that you see with metabolic syndrome. This is when you get your renal disease, your liver disease, your atherosclerosis, your stroke, your cardiovascular disease, cancer, even Alzheimer's. Right now, in some of the studies that you read right now, they actually call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. Okay? So this is no little thing. Now the problem is, how do you know? How do you know if you have these small, dense LDLs or if you have these large, buoyant LDLs? Because when you go to the doctor, they just check your LDL level, okay? The way you know is by you take your triglycerides level and you divide that by your good cholesterol, your HDL level, okay? And notice both of these things, these are two of the categories for metabolic syndrome. So when you do this, your triglyceride level, should be no more than twice your HDL level. And really, you'd like to have that closer to 1 to 1. But if your triglyceride level is more than twice your HDL level, this is indicative that you have a lot of these small, dense LDLs floating around your body, tearing up your blood vessels right now, that's getting ready to lead to organ damage. And remember, it takes about 20 to 30 years, but if we don't stop it, that's exactly where it's going to go. So why do we have these all these LDLs? The reason we have all these high LDLs is because we have all these triglycerides. Because of the food that we're eating that's getting converted straight into triglycerides, we have to produce all these LDLs so they can get these out of the liver. So what do? You have these little LDL boats, and they take all this fat, and they're going all around your body, and they're going to all these little subcutaneous cells so they can put it in there. But you have subcutaneous tissue all over your body, and that's why. You have small glycogen stores, because that's your fight or flight, but then you have all these subcutaneous cells, and this is why it takes 20 to 30 years for this stuff to start showing up. Because if you continuously stuff your fat cells and you never give your chance the body to burn it off, you just stuff it to where all of a sudden these little LDL boats, they're floating all around your body looking for this fat cell, and when they finally get there, all your fat cells are stuffed. There's no more place to put it. So what do these little LDL boats do? All they can do is just go right back to where the fat was being produced in the first place, which is your liver. And now it starts depositing all this fat around your liver, and that's when you end up with a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now you have a stuffed liver full of fat, and now this leaks over and you start getting a pancreas that's full of fat. And now when you have that, now it starts doing damage to your beta cells, which means you can't produce enough insulin, which means now you have uncontrolled high glucose levels, okay? See the process of what's going on? Now, you might be saying, well, so what are you saying? I can never have sugar again? I can never have processed food again? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the exact same thing that Paracelsus said back in the early 1500s. Paracelsus is the father of toxicology. And at that time, what he said was the dose makes the poison, okay? Having a little bit is going to be fine, but that's not what we do. So how much do we need? Well, in a normal 70-kilo person, and you're thinking about a blood glucose of 80 to 100 milligrams per deciliter, floating around in our bodies at any time is equivalent to about 1 teaspoon of sugar. That's what's in our circulatory system now. Now compare that to 10 teaspoons of sugar in 1 can of pop. Okay? Now, if you only have 1 can of soda pop, and that's all, and then you eat perfectly healthy the rest of the time, you're fine. You're fine. You have plenty of subcutaneous tissue to take care of that extra glucose load, that extra fat load, and hopefully you fill your cell and then you empty it, and then you fill your cells and you empty it, and you're not just constantly stuffing it. But is that what we do? No, that's not what we do. We eat sugar in every single thing we come in contact with. It's in all our sugar-sweetened beverages, all our bottles, all our fruit juices that are just loaded with stuff. It's in all our bags. It's in our crackers. It's in our boxes. This poor cereal that's loaded with sugar, we feed this to our kids. We give them the sugar load here, and then we give them fruit juices and send them there with a candy bar and whatever. We're loading these kids down. Remember I said that glucose, all that is, all starch is, starch. That's what starch is, which is flour. That's what's going to be in all this stuff. So there's no such thing as a sugar-free anything that's made with flour, because flour is glucose, okay? The other thing is in all our condiments, any of the condiments that we have. It's in all the fast food restaurants that we go to all the time. Probably making people hungry, aren't they? It's in all the desserts, all the candies, all the treats we eat. Basically, if it's in a box, bag, can, or bottle, we shouldn't be putting that in our mouths. If it has a label on it, then we probably shouldn't be putting that in our mouths. And look here, if you'll see the baby food that's in here, that's exactly right. A ton of our baby food has a ton of sugar in it. Some of it up to 55% high fructose corn syrup. And that's why right now we have an epidemic of obese 6-month-olds today. It's because of all the stuff that we're putting in them. Now, if you think you're going to be able to read a label and say, well, I'll just read a label and see how much sugar's in there, think again. Because they've taken and they have all kinds of names for sugar, and it's all through the label. Because if they just put all this together and said sugar, that'd be the very first ingredient on the list. And that's not what they do. It's everywhere. And this is why anytime that I read, watched, or listened to a study from any of the countries around the world, of any of these scientists, these nutritionists, these physicians I've been listening to, they would always compare their diet of their country with a SAD diet. I thought, what's a SAD diet? I didn't know what that was. Well, then I realized that's exactly what it is. It's the standard American diet. That's a SAD diet. And it is a SAD diet because of all the processed food that we take in on a day-to-day basis. It's horrible. And it's also a SAD diet because what I found out is we truly do have one of the greatest medical systems in any country in this entire world. However, we also are ranked extremely high for the most unhealthy population of any country in this entire world. And it's all because of what we eat. Okay, so how do we eat? Okay, how should we eat? I saw this and I really liked it. I thought this was cool. How many people in here like to go camping? Anybody? How many people like to sit around a good campfire? See, I do too. Love it, love it. And you're sitting there, you know how you sit around a campfire and you have all this kindling around you and you throw the kindling on the fire and let it burn, then you throw kindling on the fire and let it burn, throw kindling on the fire and let it burn? No. Nobody does a campfire like that. That's crazy. What you do is you get the fire going and with the kindling, and then you throw on these big old logs, and then you sit back and you just kind of enjoy the nice little fire, and they start to burn down, so you throw on some more big old logs and sit back and enjoy it. That's exactly how we're supposed to burn energy with us. In this scenario, the kindling is our carbs. That's our processed food, okay? The big logs, obviously, that's our subcutaneous fat tissue. That's how we're supposed to burn it. Now look at this. If you've got these big old logs burning in your campfire and you want to throw on some kindling every now and then, go ahead. It'll burn up the kindling and go back to burn these big old logs. What we're not supposed to be doing is throwing kindling on kindling on kindling, which is what we do. The other thing is, in this scenario, we're the insulin. We're the ones that determine, is this fire going to burn kindling or is it going to burn the big logs? Okay? So what is insulin? Insulin is, like we've already said, it's a hormone that gets excreted from the pancreas, from the beta cells in the pancreas, and insulin is a storage hormone. That's what insulin does. It stores. You take in a meal, and our insulin says, okay, you get stored as glycogen, and you get stored as fat, okay? So it tells your body, stop burning fat, because I'm going to bring some in. So anytime you eat and your insulin levels are high, you're telling your body not to burn fat, okay? So that brings up another scenario that I really liked. And in this scenario, what this is a hallway. This is a subway station, okay? In this scenario, the people are the glucose, and along the sides and on the cars, those are the cells in our body. And the conductors are going to be the insulin. And the conductors know that the people down here, they can only have 80 to 100 people in this hallway to equate to the 80 to 100 milligrams per deciliter of our fasting glucose. So we eat a meal, and the insulin comes down and says, okay, get out of the hallway. You guys need to go in your cells. We can only have 80 to 100 people out here. And so they push it all into the cells. So now you have all this glucose, and it's all sitting here, and they're all packed in here, and they're just riding just fine. And they're just waiting for a body to need some energy. And all of a sudden, the doors open up, and it comes out here, and it goes and gets used for whatever energy it needs. Okay? Perfectly normal. That's what it's supposed to be. However, what happens if you're sitting here and the glucose is all up here and it's sitting here and just waiting for the door to open up, and all of a sudden the door opens up and there's more glucose. It's like, oh my gosh. So all of a sudden the conductors go crazy, say, get out of here, get out of here. You need to go back in your cells, don't come out of here. And it pushes everything back in and starts freaking out and says, I need help. So what's your body do? It calls in more insulin. I need more insulin. This is pre-diabetes, okay? Pre-diabetes is when you have more insulin than you need because you have more glucose. So your glucose levels are still kind of the same, but your insulin levels are high, okay? Pre-diabetes. And what does insulin do? Insulin doesn't come in here and just make the glucose just disappear. It stuffs it into your cells. So that's what the insulin does. It comes and it starts stuffing. The cars are already full and you're pushing as much glucose in here. And they actually have these. These are called passenger rearrangement staff. And that's their job. When these cars are perfectly filled, the passenger rearrangement staff push people in so the doors will shut. That's insulin resistance. We have our cells are so stuffed that we have to bring more insulin to try to cram more and more in there. And this is what's bad, because when we start getting insulin resistance, what do? We give medications that make the pancreas produce more insulin, or we give insulin, okay? And as you can see, it doesn't matter how much insulin we get, we're not going to get any better because our cells will only hold so much. So then what happens? All of a sudden now, we have glucose coming out all over in our blood vessels, okay? And this is when we come into it. This is when we have full-blown diabetes, and that's when we come in as doctors and say, whoa, you can't have high blood glucose because high glucose causes all kinds of other damage, which I also wanted to tell you about, but because of time I can't do it. But you don't want high glucose levels, but what else can you do? All we can do is give things that make us produce more insulin, okay? And anybody in here who's either on insulin, or if you give insulin to patients, you know your patients get more and more obese, because that's what it does. That's how insulin works, okay? So that's why I don't like to think of this as pre-diabetes and diabetes. I like to think of this as pre-diabetes. And I don't even mean back this far. I mean back before 1980. That's the pre-diabetes era, okay? This was back when we ate God-made food. We ate real animals, real animal fat, real fruits, real vegetables, and we didn't feel like we had to eat all the time. Why do we feel like we have to eat all the time, every 2 to 3 hours? This is not conscious control. This is actually under hormonal control. So what happens when we eat? The first thing we have is we have these stretch receptors in our stomach. So that when you eat, these stretch receptors, they fill up and they say, okay, I'm not hungry anymore, stop eating. Well, this is all well and good for about 2 to 3 hours, and all of a sudden then all the food comes out of your stomach and goes into your small intestine. Now, once it gets into the small intestine, there's a substance, a hormone that gets secreted called cholecystokinin. Cholecystokinin is in the top part of your intestine, and this gets secreted when it comes in contact with fatty acids and a little bit of protein, okay? On further down in the lower small intestine, in the colon, there's another hormone that gets secreted called peptide YY, okay? Peptide YY gets stimulated by the presence of amino acids or protein and a little bit of fat. Cholecystokinin and peptide YY, when these get secreted, they go up to the medial hypothalamus in the brain, and they tell your brain, I'm not hungry, don't eat anymore. So this is why when you have a meal that has protein and fat in it, it actually keeps you full for longer periods of time, okay? However, if you're talking about carbohydrates, especially in processed food, these processed carbs, what happens is after it gets out of the stomach, it doesn't go through the intestine. It gets in and it goes immediately, gets shunted through the portal veins straight to the liver to be metabolized, like we've already talked about, straight into triglycerides. Which means when you eat processed food, as you probably already know, you don't stay hungry for very long, or you don't stay full for very long at all. so we tend to eat again. The other thing that happens is once this food gets absorbed and it goes around to our subcutaneous fat cells, our subcutaneous fat cells, when they get full, there's actually another hormone that they've recently discovered called leptin. Your fat cells secrete this hormone called leptin, and leptin does the same thing. Leptin goes up to the medial hypothalamus in the brain and says, I'm not hungry, stop eating, okay? Now, they were very, very excited when they found this. They thought, oh, we finally got something that we can give to patients and they won't get hungry anymore. So they gave it to skinny patients, and sure enough, they did not get hungry anymore. But then when they gave that to obese patients, what they found out is that obese patients, they don't have leptin deficiency, they have leptin resistance. They're so obese that their fat cells are producing so much leptin that the hypothalamus becomes resistant to it. So now when you have resistant to the leptin, that means, again, that makes you where you're hungry all the time. The other thing they found out is they think that insulin levels, when your insulin levels are high, those also are causing resistance to the leptin, which means that anytime you eat something that keeps your insulin levels high all the time, you're actually making yourself become more and more hungry because you're blocking that leptin. Okay? So, the other thing that makes you want to be hungry all the time is another substance in the brain called the Nucleus Accumbens. The Nucleus Accumbens is the organ in your brain that's responsible for the pleasure center. And this is the exact same pleasure center whether you're relaxing on a beach under palm trees, or whether you're snorting cocaine, or whether you're eating sugar. They found that sugar affects the nucleus accumbens the same way that cocaine does, and any other pleasure. And just like with cocaine, how you have to snort more and more and more, it's because you're getting resistance in the nucleus accumbens. So it takes more and more to get that. So what we've done is sugar is also, if you eat sugar all the time, you're starting to get resistance in the nucleus accumbens. And they found that when you get this resistance, you're not only resistant to the substance that's causing the resistance, but you're resistant to all pleasures in life. And they really think that this has a lot to do also with a lot of the depression that we see now, because we are actually addicted to this, sugar, okay? So, speaking of emotions, this takes me back to where I was 2 years ago when I finally went back to the literature and realized that everything that I knew about nutrition was totally wrong. And this is why I stayed in the literature for the next 2 years, so I could try to find out what I could do to stop this obesity crisis on my own. And this is when I realized that I had to change what I ate, and I had to change when I ate it. And I also realized that I needed to stay in the literature and continue to learn more and more so I could help educate other people why it's so important that they also change what they eat and when they eat it. And for this reason, right now, what I want to do is I'm just going to sum up what I've talked about, because you may not know it, but I've really talked about a lot of things in 45 minutes. I mean, it was very hard cutting this program down. So this is just going to be, the next few slides are just a real quick recap of what I've said. Okay, what I've said, because of the nucleus accumbens and because of the bacteria in your gut, which I didn't even get a chance to talk to you about, these two things have actually made it to where we are actually addicted to processed food and to sugar, okay? That's why it's so hard to stop. And then once we eat this processed food, it gets into our intestines. It does not stimulate cholecystokinin. It does not stimulate peptide YY. Therefore, we don't stay full for very long at all, okay? The other thing now, when this processed food gets absorbed into our bodies, it causes our insulin levels to rise, okay? When our insulin levels rise, this does two different things. One, the insulin goes to our medial hypothalamus and it blocks leptin, so it makes it where we're hungry all the time. The other thing insulin does is the storage hormone, so it tells our body, stop burning fat, we're going to store it instead. Okay? So now we're storing all this fat in our bodies, and now that does two different things also. When we have stuffed fat cells in our subcutaneous fat cells, what this does is it causes so much insulin or leptin to be released that we actually get resistance to leptin in our medial hypothalamus, which means now we're hungry all the time. The other thing that happens when we have these stuffed fat cells is we have nowhere else to put the more fat that we're putting in our mouths. So what it ends up doing is now it goes and it starts getting a fatty liver, which leads into a fatty pancreas, which leads into beta cell dysfunction, which now leads into high blood glucose levels. So when you have these high blood glucose levels and you combine that with these small, dense LDLs that are being produced by this processed food, you put those two together, and now all of a sudden you get damage through our glycocalyx and endothelial lining, and now you end up with all the kind of organ damage that we see with metabolic syndrome. okay? And that's what leads us to poor quality of life and early death, okay, just by what we're putting in our mouths. Now, this isn't all gloom and doom. This isn't all gloom and doom. This is actually really good news because it means that we don't have to take medication to take care of this. All we have to do is change our thoughts, change our choices, okay? And which goes right back to Paracelsus once again, when he said the art of healing comes from nature, not from the physician. The only way to change this is we have to change what we eat and change when we eat it. So, what do we eat? What we need to eat is God-made food. We need to go back. We basically, if it was never alive to begin with, we might not want to put that in our mouths, okay? Eat living things. Living things feed living things. And this is why you should shop the perimeter of the stores. That's where you find your good, healthy meat, your good fruits, your vegetables, your whole milk, your real butter. Stay away from anything that says low fat, no fat. The processing it takes to get the fat, you ought to watch it. The processing it takes to get the fat out of this stuff is absolutely horrible, and it's so toxic to our bodies. And definitely stay away from the chocolate milk. There's a ton of high fructose corn syrup in that also. And also stay away from the middle of the aisles. That's where your boxes, bags, cans, bottles, anything, if you have to read a label to see if it's going to be healthy for you, chances are it's not, okay? If it's got a label on it, you might not want to put it in your body. The other thing with eating God-made food is this will stimulate your cholecystokinin, your peptide YY, and it will keep you hungry or keep you satisfied for longer periods of time, which leads into time. After being in the literature for these last 2 years, I personally am a firm believer that we need to go back to teaching our bodies to be fat burners like we used to be back before 1980, back in the pre-diabetes era, okay? Just 1980, it wasn't that long ago. And go back to where, and choose not to burn these carbs for our energy. Choose to be these fat burners that we want to be. And for adults, there's a ton of information out there on how to do this. But basically all it means is just skip one meal a day. Skip one meal a day and eat all your food in a 6 to 8 hour period. Okay, that's the start. And then all the other 16 to 18 hours, use that time to actually burn that energy back out of your fat cells again. Remember, you should be storing, burning, not just storing it all the time like we do now. As far as kids, what this means, it means if they're not hungry, don't make them eat. If they don't want to clean their plate, don't make them clean their plate. But don't let them have all this processed food in between meals either, okay? Keep them away from that. I highly recommend, I really do, I highly recommend everybody go back, get in your cabinets, get in your refrigerators, and get rid of all your processed food, get rid of all your sugar-sweetened beverages. You can't control what your kids do when they go out to their friend's house, but you have 100% control over what they do in your own house, okay? And I really implore you, we've got to stop hurting our children, okay, with these poisons. So this leads me to my last slide. And this really did happen also, my boys. One time my boy fell down, he hurt his knee, and he started crying. And he cried for a little bit, and then after he got done crying, he came over, he said, "Dad," he said, "why is it that when kids get hurt, they cry, but when adults get hurt, they don't cry?" I said, "Well, buddy, it's kind of like this." He said, "When you fall down and get hurt, it's an automatic response. Bam, you start crying. But then there comes a time that you realize you're crying. Now, once you realize you're crying, now you have a choice. You either continue to cry or you stop. Well, with us, with adults, we've been hurt so many times that we know as soon as we get hurt, we already know we have a choice. And so most of us choose not to cry. And that's where you guys are right now. I have a feeling that when you came in here before my talk, you knew the processed food wasn't very good for you. You knew sugar wasn't very good for you. But I have a feeling it was just automatic response. When you got hungry, you just reached for some processed food. Chips, candy, cookies, pop, whatever, okay? But I also have a feeling that you did not know how truly toxic this stuff is to your bodies. And I also have a feeling you did not know how extremely important it is that we choose to be carb burners or be fat burners and not carb burners. We have to choose what we eat and when we eat it. However, if I've done my job right through this talk, now you know. So, are there any questions? If I have time for questions.